David Reimer. Imagine you're a fresh parent in Winnipeg back in 1965. You have a pair of identical twin boys named Bruce and Brian. They're healthy and happy kids, but at 8 months old, the doctors notice a problem. Both boys are diagnosed with phimosis, which is a condition when a boy has banana foreskin that is too tight. The solution is a standard circumcision. Simple, right? Well, in 1966, the doctor decided to get fancy. Instead of using a normal steel blade, he used an electrocautery needle. This is basically a superheated wire used to cut tissue. This turned out to be a massive mistake. The machine malfunctioned and surged with way too much electricity. In a split second, the device practically burned Bruce's entire device. The damage was total and permanent. The parents were absolutely devastated and guilt-ridden. They were desperate to give their son a normal life, so they went looking for a miracle. Their search led them to Dr. John Money at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. This guy was a superstar in the psychology world and a rising legend in the field of gynecology. Dr. Money had this wild new theory that gender was a social construct. He believed that babies are born as blank slates, and that you aren't a boy or a girl, but that you learn to be one through your upbringing. To him, the Reimer twins were the perfect test subject. He could turn Bruce into a girl and keep Brian as a boy to finally prove that nurture is stronger than nature. So, Dr. Money convinced the parents to go through with the most extreme makeover in history. At 22 months old, they castrated Bruce and renamed him Brenda. They had to force Bruce to wear dresses, play with dolls, and never tell the poor kid the truth. If they slipped up or hesitated, Dr. Money warned that the child would be psychologically ruined forever. And for the next 10 years, the family traveled to see Money. The doctor wrote reports saying Brenda was a perfect, dainty little lady who loved dolls. He claimed the experiment was a huge success, but that was a lie. Behind closed doors, Dr. Money was a PDF file. He forced the twins to get naked and inspect each other's genitals. He made them simulate adult positions and called it practice, and even took pictures. Back at home, Bruce was miserable. The kid hated dresses and insisted on peeing standing up. School was a nightmare too because bullies. They called Bruce Cavewoman for walking like a trucker. By age 13, he was totally done with life. He told his parents he would unalive himself if they forced him to see that fake doctor one more time. Hearing that, the parents finally cracked. They told Bruce the truth about the botched surgery and the secret experiment. You might think Bruce would be crushed by this news, but he was actually relieved. He finally understood why he felt so weird. He immediately shaved his head, threw out the skirts, took the name David, and got surgery to fix his body. He also got married later on, but the trauma lived with the twins. David's twin brother Brian couldn't handle the memories of the abuse and died of a drug overdose. David blamed himself, and 2 years later, with his marriage falling apart, David drove to a grocery parking lot and ended his life with a shotgun. Vanderbilt Nutrition Study. In 1945, pregnant women in Nashville, Tennessee were lining up at a free prenatal clinic run by Vanderbilt University. In those days, free healthcare was rare, and these women were mostly poor. They were thrilled to have top-tier doctors looking after their unborn babies. The doctor told them they were part of a nutrition study to help make their babies strong, but the doctors were lying. They weren't there to give nutrition, they were there to feed these women radioactive poison. After the US government dropped the bombs on Japan, they asked themselves, what if that was us? They wanted to know exactly what radiation actually did to the human body. But you can't just ask for volunteers to be exposed to nuclear radiation. So the government went looking for people who would not ask questions, and they found the perfect spot at a hospital in Vanderbilt University. This hospital had a free clinic full of pregnant women who trusted the doctors completely. These ladies were perfect victims, and so began the funded secret mission called the Tennessee Vanderbilt Nutrition Project. The plan was to trick these women during their regular doctor visits. During a routine checkup, a nurse would hand the expectant mother a small cup of clear liquid. She would smile and say, "Drink this. It's a vitamin cocktail for you and the baby." The women trusted the nurse, so they drank it. But as you expect, the cup had radioactive materials. The doctors just wanted to use the women and their fetuses to see how fast the radiation absorbed into the blood and crossed into the baby. But the radiation didn't just disappear when the women left the clinic. It stayed in their bodies and attacked the developing cells of their babies. Then, about 24 years later, in 1969, the researchers tracked down the mothers and children to see the results. Well, they found a huge spike in cancer. The children were dying of leukemia and rare tumors. But instead of telling the families the truth, the doctors just wrote it down in their journals and kept their mouths shut. To them, these dying children were just interesting statistics. The secret stayed buried until 1993. That was when the U.S. Energy Secretary Hazel O'Leary finally declassified the files. The women were horrified. They realized that the doctors they trusted had tricked them into poisoning their own children. A lawsuit followed, and Vanderbilt eventually paid out $10.3 million. But money doesn't really fix the fact that a nurse looked a pregnant woman in the eye and fed her radiation with a smile. San Quentin Testicular Transplants. The year is 1918. You're standing in the yard of San Quentin State Prison in California. It's a fortress filled with the state's worst murderers and thieves. Most people thought they needed to be locked away forever. But a new chief surgeon called Dr. Leo Stanley saw something completely different. You see, Dr. Stanley had a very specific theory. He believed that men didn't commit crimes because they were evil or poor. He thought they were running low on testosterone, and it made them degenerates. And what's the testosterone producer? The family jewels. So he turned the prison into his own personal Frankenstein lab. His goal was to rejuvenate the old and weak prisoners by giving them fresh balls. But where do you get fresh balls in a prison? The execution platform. Whenever a prisoner was executed, Dr. Stanley was waiting right there. As soon as the body dropped, while the body was still warm, he would rush in and slice off the testicles. And then he would run down the hall to the operating room where a living inmate was strapped to a table. He would take the dead man's parts and surgically implant them into the living man's scrotum. But it was a disaster, because the human body is actually smart and knows when something doesn't belong there. So the stolen body parts would literally rot and turn into mush inside the sack. Eventually, the body would just push the dead tissue out, leaving the patient in agony. But Stanley never gave up on his bad ideas, so he just changed the method. He started taking the harvested testicles and grinding them up. He mashed them until they had the consistency of toothpaste. Then, he loaded this testicle smoothie into a giant syringe and injected it directly into the prisoners' stomachs. He claimed this sludge cured everything, from asthma to acne to the urge to rob banks. But there was a problem. The prison wasn't executing people fast enough to keep up with Stanley's demand. He needed more product. So he went to the farms. He started importing goats, boars, rams, and deer. The prison hospital basically became a meat house. Stanley would slice up goat testicles and implant them into human beings. He truly believed that the animal energy would transfer to the men and make them strong again. Stanley was also very racist and believed in white supremacy, that white people were superior to everyone else. But when it came to surgery, he had zero problem taking parts from dead black or Asian prisoners and putting them into white guys, who also didn't care at all. They were so desperate to get their mojo back that they forgot all about their racism. Dr. Stanley spent 38 years running that prison hospital, and during that time, he performed the procedures on over 600 men. Some volunteered because they were desperate, but many were forced into it. He even wrote a book bragging about it called Men at Their Worst and retired as the chief surgeon in 1951. He even got a nice job working on cruise ships afterwards and died at age 90 without ever facing a single criminal charge. Guatemala experiments. In 1946, in the streets of Guatemala City, a team of American researchers arrived with crates of medical supplies. They were funded by the National Institutes of Health and led by a doctor named John C. Cutler. They told the local government they were there to test the new miracle drug, penicillin, to fight sexually transmitted diseases. But that was a lie, because what Cutler actually wanted was to intentionally infect healthy people with syphilis to see if penicillin could work against the disease. He actually tried to do this in the US first, at a prison in Indiana, but it was a failure. He couldn't get the prisoners sick fast enough to get good data, and the legal rules in the US made it too hard to force the experiment on people. So he needed a place where the rules didn't apply, and he found Guatemala. The government there didn't ask questions, and the population of poor people could be treated like lab rats without any lawyers getting in the way. At first, he paid infected hookers to sleep with prisoners and soldiers, but the soldiers weren't catching the disease fast enough for his liking. So Cutler decided to take matters into his own hands. Literally, the doctors would take a sharp metal instrument, scrape the skin off a man's privates to create an open wound, and then rub infectious pus directly into the bloody cut. Now, you're probably asking, why on earth would any guy stand still and let a doctor scrape his junk? Well, these were soldiers who were ordered by their commanders and prisoners who were threatened by guards. When the guy with a gun says, "Drop your pants," you drop your pants. But even that wasn't enough. The soldiers and prisoners could still physically resist or complain too loudly. Cutler needed total control, so he moved his operation to a psychiatric hospital. These patients were trapped, confused, and completely unable to fight back. With no one around to stop them, the researchers got violent. They injected syphilis straight into the patient's spinal fluid. They rubbed gonorrhea pus into eyes and rectums just to see if the infection would stick. One of his victims was a woman named Berta. In February 1948, Cutler injected her arm with syphilis. She immediately started to rot. She developed scabs all over, and her skin began wasting away from her body. By August, she looked like a walking corpse. Even though Berta was clearly fading away, Cutler used her for more tests. On the very day he noted that she looked like she was dying, he decided to use her body for one last test. He put gonorrhea pus into her eyes and reinfected her with syphilis just for kicks. Her eyes filled with pus and she started bleeding from her urethra. She died 4 days later. Between 1946 and 1948, Cutler and his crew intentionally infected at least 1,300 people. This was a massive operation officially funded by the US government through the National Institutes of Health. They knew the whole thing was evil, so they kept it a secret and never published a single word about it. The files just sat in a box, gathering dust until a historian named Susan Reverby found them by accident in 2010. The news was so bad that President Obama had to call the president of Guatemala to issue a formal apology. But saying sorry 60 years later does not fix the lives they ruined. Marion Sims' Fistula Surgeries. The year is 1845. You're walking through the sweltering streets of Montgomery, Alabama. At that time, Alabama was the center of the domestic slave trade. Rich plantation owners come here to buy and sell human beings like they're purchasing farm equipment. In the middle of all this, there's Dr. J. Marion Sims. He's a small-town doctor with a massive ambition. He wants to have his name in the history books. But to do that, he needs a discovery. He needs a problem that no other doctor can fix. And he found his golden ticket in a nasty condition called a fistula. This is a specific injury that happens when, during childbirth, the baby gets stuck in the birth canal for days. The pressure crushes the mother's inside against her pelvic bone until the flesh literally dies and rots away. This leaves a gaping hole between the bladder and the private parts. It's a disturbing injury. The woman loses all control of her bladder and leaks urine 24/7. She smells bad and gets terrible infections. Back then, if you had this, you were basically an outcast. For the slave owners, this was a financial problem. These women couldn't work in the house because of the smell, and more importantly, they couldn't have any more babies. To a slave owner, a woman who can't produce more slaves is a broken asset. So Sims made a deal with the owners. He offered to take these broken assets off their hands and fix them. After that, Sims built a private hospital in the owner's backyard. It was technically a clinic, but for the women inside, it was a prison. He gathered at least 12 enslaved women to use as test subjects. We only know the names of 3, Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy. Since they were property, they couldn't say no. The experiments were absolute torture. Take Anarcha, for example. She was only 17 years old. Over the course of 4 years, Sims performed 30 separate surgeries on her. 30 times. He would slice into her raw, inflamed tissue, stitch it up with different materials, and wait to see if it worked. When the stitches got infected and the wound ripped open again, he just waited for her to heal up a little bit, strapped her back down on the table, and cut her open again. Then there was Lucy. During her surgeries, Sims forced her to stay on her hands and knees with her head resting on her arms for hours. This is now famous as the Sims position. It gave Sims a better view of the injury, but for Lucy, it was pure agony. She endured the surgery, got a severe infection, and was likely poisoned by a sponge the doctor left inside her bladder. But as soon as she recovered, Sims put her right back on the table. And he did all of this while the women were fully awake. Anesthesia was invented in 1846, right in the middle of these experiments. Sims definitely knew about it, he just refused to use it. He believed the racist idea that black people had tougher nervous systems and didn't feel pain the same way white people did. He literally called this torture minor discomfort. The only drug he gave them was opium, and that wasn't for pain relief. It was to make them severely constipated so they wouldn't poop and mess up his stitches. These women were trapped in a cycle of being sliced open without painkillers and then drugged into paralysis. Eventually, Sims figured out that using silver wire sutures prevented infection. He cured the fistula and became a superstar. The medical world called him the father of gynecology. For over a century, a statue of him stood in New York's Central Park. It was finally taken down in 2018 after people realized you shouldn't build monuments to monsters. but his name is still practically everywhere in the medical field. Oh, and he's actually the guy who invented the old speculum too. Yeah, you can tell he did not care about women at all. Project 4.1. In March 1954, on a tiny strip of sand called Bikini Atoll in the Pacific Ocean, the US military was about to test a thermonuclear bomb codenamed Castle Bravo. The scientists thought they already calculated exactly how big the boom would be, but they were wrong. The explosion was 1,000 times stronger than the Hiroshima bomb and made a massive cloud of death. And then, nature decided to make it worse. The wind suddenly changed direction. Instead of blowing the radioactive smoke out to the empty ocean, the breeze pushed it straight towards the islands of Rongelap and Utrecht. These islands were full of families who had no idea what was coming their way. A few hours after the blast, something that looked like snow started falling from the sky. The children immediately ran outside to play in it. They caught the flakes on their tongues and rubbed the white powder all over their bodies. But it wasn't snow. It was crushed coral that had been cooked by a nuclear bomb and covered in radioactive poison. Pretty soon, the symptoms started to show. People started throwing up and their skin began to peel off in sheets like a bad sunburn. The US military knew exactly where that radioactive cloud was going, but they didn't rush in to save everyone. Instead, they waited 2 whole days to evacuate the islanders. And once they finally showed up, they didn't treat these people like patients. They treated them like test subjects. The government quietly started a secret program called Project 4.1. They claimed it was a study of accidental exposure, but secret papers found years later suggest the US planned to use the islanders as test subjects that they could study until they died. The doctors poked and prodded the islanders every year, but they weren't trying to cure them. They were just collecting data, and the results were horrifying. Women on the islands started giving birth to things that the locals called jellyfish babies. These poor infants were born with see-through skin, no bones, missing limbs, or no faces at all. They would only live for a few hours before dying in their mother's arms. It got so bad that women were scared to even get pregnant because they didn't want to see what came out. The radiation also cooked their insides. Years later, almost everyone started growing lumps on their necks. The rate of thyroid cancer shot up to 3 times higher than normal. The US solution was to just cut everyone's thyroid glands out and put them on pills for the rest of their lives. This made them totally dependent on American doctors just to stay alive. Dachau hypothermia experiments. Imagine you're a German pilot flying over the freezing North Sea in 1942. Your engine fails and you crash land into the icy water. You survive the crash, but the water is so cold that it sucks the heat right out of your body. Within minutes, your muscles lock up. Your heart stops, and you die of hypothermia. This was happening to hundreds of Nazi pilots, and it made the high command furious. They needed to know exactly how long a man could survive in freezing water, and, more importantly, how to warm him up before the pilots died. To get the answer, the Nazi high command turned to Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, and basically the architect of the Holocaust. Then, he handed the project to a guy named Dr. Sigmund Rascher. Now, Rascher was technically a doctor, but he wasn't some kind of medical genius. He was actually just a low-level captain in the Air Force who was super desperate for a promotion. He knew that the quickest way to climb the ladder in the Nazi regime was to do the dirty work that no one else wanted to do. So, he set up a secret lab at Dachau concentration camp. It was a brutal prison for Nazi enemies, Jews, political rivals, and Russian soldiers. To Rascher, they were just lab rats. Rascher built massive wooden tanks in the barracks, and then filled them with ice water and kept the temperature just above freezing. After that, he forced naked, starving men to climb into the tub. Some were drugged to act like unconscious pilots, but most were wide awake. Rascher and his team just stood there with clipboards, watching the life drain out of them. They recorded every detail, the exact second the shivering stopped, the moment the hallucinations kicked in, and the instant the heart finally gave out. To give you an idea of how bad it was, one witness tells a story about 2 Soviet officers who were incredibly tough. These guys managed to stay conscious in the freezing water for nearly 5 hours, but eventually even they broke. Before they died, they looked Rascher in the eye and asked him why he didn't just shoot them. But freezing the men to death was only half the job. The Nazis also needed to figure out how to thaw them out. Rascher tried a few logical things, like throwing the frozen bodies into boiling hot baths, and that actually worked pretty well. They also thought the body heat of a woman would work better than hot water. So Rascher brought in female prisoners from another camp and then forced these women to strip naked and get into bed with the dying frozen men to see if they could warm them up with body heat alone. Rasher even tracked if an intimate moment happened because he thought a boner was a sign that the man was coming back to life. The crazy part is that this data is still unique today. Rasher did discover that rapid rewarming in hot water is the best way to save a hypothermia victim. That specific knowledge saves lives today. But it doesn't change the fact that he got those results by torturing men to death in ice tanks. Ravensbrück War Wounds Experiment. Imagine you're a top doctor for the Nazis in 1942, named Karl Gebhardt, and you just messed up big time. You were treating a high-ranking officer named Reinhard Heydrich, who got blown up by a bomb. But at that time, you were faced with two choices. You could use the new medicine called sulfa drugs to stop infection, or you could just do surgery. You were arrogant, so you thought surgery was enough and refused to use the meds. But then, Heydrich died from a nasty infection, and your big boss was furious. The Austrian painter himself blamed you for the death, so now you have to save your own skin. You need to prove that the pills would not have worked anyway, so you don't get executed for incompetence. This is exactly what happened to Dr. Karl Gebhardt in 1942. When Heydrich died, Karl looked like an idiot, so he needs to prove that the medicine was useless anyway so he wouldn't get fired or killed. And to do that, he needed data and subjects to be experimented on. But you cannot get that kind of data from rats or monkeys. So Karl turned his eyes towards Ravensbrück concentration camp. This was a prison for women, for Polish students, and resistance fighters. Here, the camp staff selected 74 girls to be the test subjects for this twisted trial. They even nicknamed the women rabbits, because they were nothing more than lab animals to the doctors. Karl also brought in two other doctors named Fritz Fischer and Herta Oberhuser to help him. So now we get into the experiment. After they chose the women, they took them to the camp hospital and put them under anesthesia. Once the women were asleep, the doctors took knives and sliced deep into their calves and thighs until the blade hit bone. Since battlefield wounds are never clean, the doctors had to make these cuts dirty on purpose. So they stuffed the open muscle with things you would find on the ground during a war, like wood shavings, rusty nails, and broken glass. Then they poured in deadly bacteria that causes gangrene, a disease that makes flesh rot and die. Finally, they sewed the skin shut tight. This trapped the dirt and germs inside without any air, which is exactly what that specific bacteria needs to grow and eat the muscle. It worked exactly how you would expect. The legs of the victims became disturbing. They swelled up to twice their normal size. They filled with hot pus and turned black from the dead tissue. And when the woman woke up, they were screaming in agony with high fevers. The rest were just more evil. When the women begged for water or painkillers, they refused to give them anything. If a woman became too sick to provide good data, they finished them off by injecting them with gasoline or fennel poison, which killed them instantly. These horrific experiments went on from July 1942 until late 1943. The other prisoners in the camp realized what was happening and actually managed to hide many of the victims in the dark attics to keep them safe. Because of their bravery, a lot of the women actually survived until the war ended, but Karl didn't get away with it. In 1947, he was put on trial at the famous doctor's trial, where the court found him guilty of war crimes and sentenced him to death by hanging. Mengele's twin experiments in 1944. At Auschwitz camp in Poland, a train full of prisoners came to a stop. It had carried thousands of Jewish families from their homes to be processed. In the middle of the screaming guards and crying babies, there was Josef Mengele. His job was deciding whether people were sentenced to forced labor or death. But Mengele had his own agenda. He and his old mentor named Ottmar von Verschwer were totally obsessed with twins. They believed that if they studied identical twins, they could unlock the secrets of genetics. They wanted to figure out how to make German mothers give birth to two Aryan babies at once to build a master race army twice as fast. To do this, he set up a creepy human zoo in the barracks. Whenever a new shipment of victims arrived at the camp, he would run around and look for twins. If he found a pair, he snatched these children from their parents and treated them like VIPs. They got to keep their hair, wear their own clothes, and eat decent food. The children even called him Uncle Pepe, but this was not a kindness. He was just fattening them up for the slaughter, like a Thanksgiving turkey. One day he brought candies to the kids, and the next day he would strap them to a table and slice them open. Mengele wanted to see if twins shared a special blood connection, so he drained the blood from one twin and pumped it into the other just to see what happened. He measured every inch of their bodies like he was judging livestock. One survivor, named Eva Moses Kor, lived through the worst of it, alongside her twin sister, Miriam. She was taken to the blood lab where doctors tied her arms down and injected her with 5 mystery drugs. Mengele laughed while saying she would be dead in 2 weeks, and if he was right, he planned to kill her twin sister Miriam immediately, just to cut them both open and compare their insides. So Ava literally refused to die just to save her sister. But surviving the blood test was only half the battle. Mengele was also obsessed with appearances. He wanted to know if he could physically change a person's eyes to the Nazis' ideal color, blue eyes. And to achieve that, he injected painful chemicals and dyes directly into children's eyeballs to try and change the color. It obviously didn't work. It just caused blindness and terrible infections. When the children died from the pain, he cut their eyes out and printed them to a board to send to his research buddies in Berlin. And it gets worse. A nurse named Vera Alexander watched Mengele take 2 Romani twins named Guido and Ina. When he brought them back, he had sewn them together back to back. He surgically connected their veins and organs to create artificial conjoined twins. The children screamed in agony day and night. Their wounds started to rot and smell like death. They were found by their parents, who saw no other choice than to end their children's suffering via morphine overdose. In the end, Mengele never went to jail. He escaped to South America and lived a free life until he drowned in a swimming accident in 1979. But his crimes would not stay buried. Ava Kor and the other twins dedicated their lives to telling the world the truth.